Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast. As much as we hate to admit it, the Philadelphia Eagles are the gold standard in the NFC East, and right now, sadly, unfortunately, in the NFL at large, as they are the defending Super Bowl champions. And as we gear up for the 2025 season, here to help me talk about the 2025 Eagles is Brandon Lee Gouton of Bleeding Green Nation. Brandon, thank you so much for the time today.
Ed, thanks for having me. Good to be representing the two-time winning Super Bowl Philadelphia Eagles here with you.
I I have to ask the key question of the day. When is the breaking news Eagles are Super Bowl champion banner coming down off Bleeding Green Nation?
Yeah, so you noticed that, huh?
When is it coming down?
So I did the same thing. The Eagles won the first time in 2017 season, Super Bowl 52. I think I got rid of it. I couldn't remember if it was the beginning of training camp or right before the season, but I might do it before training camp starts next week. You know, I think that's in theme with what the team itself probably uh, is hoping to do in terms of okay, we celebrated it. The ring ceremony is actually on Friday, July 18th. It's tomorrow as we're recording this, so last chance to celebrate it.
Yeah, so turn the page, and I'm kidding with you a little bit. I don't blame you for celebrating. I'm still taking credit at Big Blue View. We launched in February of 2007, and the Giants won the Super Bowl that year. So I'm I'm still taking credit for that. So because that was our first year, so I'm still taking credit for that Super Bowl. So I can't give you too much grief for celebrating, but it is a reason to avoid going over there. anyway, anyway, let's talk Eagles, and I need to start with Jalen Hurts, and I need to start with your thoughts on this recent ESPN quarterback ranking that I don't have in front of me exactly who the 8 were that are in front of Jalen Hurts, but the ranking had him ninth, and I have to believe that rankles you a little bit and rankles the Bleeding Green Nation commenter base.
Yeah, so I've often described myself here, especially in recent years, as a Jalen Hurts centrist in terms of I think the people who have been most high on him can go a little bit overboard. I think the people who criticize him a lot can go way overboard. So I tend to find myself in the middle of that. Here, as you mentioned, the ESPN rankings, which obviously are not just one pundit's opinion, but the gathering of different, coaches and executives and scouts around the NFL, compiled by Jeremy Fowler. They have him ninth, and when you look through the rankings here, there's obviously names that you're like, okay, definitely, that's fair. There's a couple that I think you can quibble with. I think Jaden Daniels has big time upside. I'm a Jaden Daniels believer in the long term. I think doing it one season doesn't necessarily, that's not enough proof. I think you need to see more proof of concept there to kind of really do that. I think it's a little bit generous. Matthew Stafford, I think you can quibble with, but someone like Justin Herbert, I think that's a tough one. Someone who just hasn't had playoff success and in fact has had playoff failures to a big extent, the way that Jalen Hurts has not, and certainly has achieved at a very high level and played his best in his biggest games in his career. I think that's kind of being underweighted in these things. Jared Goff also right above Jalen Hurts. So I would move Hurts up a little bit. I think again, he's probably not quite as good as his biggest fans believe he is, but he's also, I think, a lot better than his detractors would seem to be in mass believe he is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a problem with Jaden Daniels being number 5, after 1 year as well. Um, but I would put it this way. I would say there is a big 4 of quarterbacks in
Right.
the NFL. Everybody wants to because it's clean and nice and it's a nice number. Everybody wants to make a top 5 list. All right, but there's a big 4 of quarterbacks in the NFL: Mahomes, Allen, Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, Jackson.
Right.
All right. And then there's a second tier. And in all honesty, I think I would probably put whoever else you want to put in that second tier. I think that's where Jalen Hurts lands.
Mhm.
Whoever else you want to put in there with him, but I couldn't help but think, when I saw that, and as I listened to you talk about Hurts a little bit, I couldn't help but think, welcome to the world of
Mhm, mhm.
defending Eli Manning. There's somewhat of a comparison there because we heard this all the time. Well, Eli got carried by the defense. Eli got carried by this. He's not that good of a quarterback. He just had a couple of good games and made a lucky throw. So been there, done that. Welcome to that world of defending your quarterback who has a ring or two.
Could be worse. Could be defending the quarterback. It could be the Cowboys fans over here telling me how great Dak Prescott is, when he can't. He literally has one of the weakest playoff resumes ever. He's like what 2-5, 2-4 in the playoffs.
Hmm.
Um, the only quarterback to ever lose to a number 7 seed in the NFL history. I mean, yeah. So it could be worse.
Yeah, it could be, I guess. So yeah. Um, but then again, a couple of years ago when I was talking to RJ Ochoa of blogging the boys, this is back when Prescott's contract was an issue and he was coming off a bad year. He asked me point blank if I would take Dak Prescott or Daniel Jones at that point. And Jones, of course, was coming off his best year. Prescott was coming off his worst year. And I said Jones.
Mhm.
And I don't look so great for that answer. you know, so so it is what it is. I want to ask you about the current Eagles. And what happens whenever you win, whenever you're good, despite the fact that Howie Roseman is a master manipulator of the salary cap, there's still there's still a top line that you can't go over, and you just can't keep everybody. Um, what in your mind are the biggest losses that the Eagles suffered, this offseason? The biggest players they're going to have a hard time, filling in for.
Yeah, I mean, the big ones they lost in free agency, obviously, you look at Josh Sweat, who actually got some votes for Super Bowl MVP. I'm not as worried about that one directly, just because I think Josh Sweat is like a good player and he had a great Super Bowl. But like, I
Mhm,
think there's times over his career where he's kind of just gone quiet. And last
mhm,
season, I don't think was an amazing season for him prior to the Super Bowl. It was a good season for him. So I think the Eagles have some exciting, yet unproven edge rushers in Nolan Smith, a former first round pick of theirs, and Jalen Hunt, who we all thought was going to be a project as a guy who was playing safety at Cornell a few years ago. And then he
mhm.
goes to Houston Christian, which you look up the film from Houston Christian and you're like, it's very grainy. And you're like, what am I watching right now? And so we all thought he was going to be a project. And even as early as training camp last year, like he looks way advanced. And at the course of the year, just continued to develop. So, they're putting some faith in young guys there. I think they'll be okay there. Maybe they could afford to add another edge rusher, a veteran out there. We'll see. That's a position that might be able to bolster that at the trade deadline, depending on how things go. Milton Williams is going to be a tough loss for them from a standpoint of, he was really productive and a really good player. And it took a while for him to kind of finally get that production going in his career, his contract year. And also, there's people who say, oh, well, like, he benefited a lot from playing next to Jalen Carter. That's absolutely true. And I was okay with the Eagles not paying Milton Williams because, again, you can't pay everyone. You're going to have to go lighter at some areas. And for a position where you do get help from Jalen Carter, and the Eagles have an up and coming player once again in Moro Ujima here, entering his third year. That looks like someone who might be able to step up. I think one of the bigger losses that they suffered wasn't in free agency, but when you look at the trade of Chauncey Gardner Johnson, and there's a lot of things that go into that with CJ. He's obviously an outspoken guy high. And probably no coincidence that he's on what is like fourth team now, or fourth team
Mhm.
change, I should say, since he returned to the Eagles in 4 years now. Like when you're having multiple teams in a short time deciding to move on from you, that probably just isn't a coincidence. So I'm not going to crush him for that. I also think it was a situation where they kind of want to pay Reed Blankenship in house, and they felt like if they're going to do that, then it would have to also address Chauncey's contract, which they didn't want to do. So I think it's an understandable move, but right now where we stand, I like Reed Blankenship a lot. That's one starting safety. Next to him, we don't know. Like it could be Sidney Brown finally steps up. He was not here when Vic Fangio was drafted. Eagles drafted Andrew Makuba in the second round, final pick of the second round this year in the 2025 NFL draft. There's some potential for him to step up and win that job. I think he actually might do that. But then you have a rookie starting for you, and that can go well, as we saw with Reed Blankenship, or sorry, with Kenan Mitchell and Cooper DeJean last year. But it's also kind of just it's a big risk and a big unknown. So I look at that safety position as one where they have to figure that out.
Do you, a couple of former Giants, crossed over and signed with the Eagles in free agency, um, likely as depth pieces. I'm curious what roles you see, for Aziz Ojolari and Adoree Jackson.
Yeah, Ojolari, I like the profile is hard not to like, right? Like a guy, he's only what 24. He's had
Mhm.
production in the NFL. Injuries have been obviously been an issue, and not only just in terms of missed games, like not being available, but also I think in what you have even echoed to me in terms of like impacting, sapping his power a little bit, like sapping some of what makes him good. And you kind of wonder about the long term effects of those injuries. And kind of just watching some of the film from him, like and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a player who's kind of just like solid more than really like truly tantalizing and excited, or worth getting like thrilled about. So I'm thinking Ojolari might just kind of be like a third, fourth edge rusher, and that's fine if he's kind of just a
And
guy who rotates in and isn't one of your top two guys. I will live with that. And then when it comes to Dory Jackson, I actually think that's an underrated addition for the Eagles here. I'm not going to say he's 100% locked to make the roster. I think he will. I think he's close to that. He's currently competing with Keely Ringo for the starting cornerback job opposite from Quinyon Mitchell. I do think Keely Ringo will win that job, but Adoree Jackson kind of sets the floor there. Where if Ringo absolutely kind of just struggles or gets hurt, then you can go to Adoree Jackson. That's a guy who started in the NFL before. Eagles have been interested in him before, actually, before he ended up signing with the Giants instead. And I also really didn't realize, I guess, how much of a personality he is. And I think that's important in a locker room where the Eagles lose Darius Slay. He was a big figure in the Eagles locker room, in the cornerback room, defensive back room specifically, where it's a long season, it's a grind, and I think at some point it's nice to have some levity. And Adoree Jackson seems to have a sense of humor and kind of add some levity to that room. And also, let's assume that Ringo stays healthy, Quinyon Mitchell stays healthy. Sometimes, I mean, they're both starting. Sometimes you need like another depth cornerback to play for you, and the Eagles had that last year. And Isaiah Rodgers, he was always there to come off the bench when the Eagles had an injury at cornerback. And Adoree Jackson, I think you could do worse in terms of having a guy to come off the bench and give you some starts.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I can see with both players, I can see, where they can fill roles, but I can't fault the Giants for really not competing in the offseason for either guy. Um, Ojolari, I don't know what contract he got from the Eagles, but considering, what the Giants had with Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns, they weren't gonna pay big money. They weren't gonna compete, for him, and Adoree had kinda run his course with the Giants, I think, so which happens with guys sometimes. It doesn't mean they're bad guys, but sometimes the tenure sort of runs its course, and I was actually surprised that Adoree Jackson was back with the Giants a year ago
Mm.
because I think the Giants and Adoree after 2023 had pretty much decided to go their own separate ways. And then all of a sudden, we go through the off season, we go through training camp, we get close to week 1, and Adoree's like, "I don't have a job." And the Giants are like, "We haven't been able to find a veteran cornerback to replace Adoree." But, oh, Adoree's still over there. So, I thought they had kinda moved on from each other, and last year was just, "Oh, we have a need and Adoree needs a job," so that's why he was a Giant. And so it was just kind of interesting. Um, gotta ask you about Saquon quickly. Gotta ask you about Saquon.
Mhm.
Obviously coming off the historic year. Um, obviously great player, but you can't expect him to do close to 2,300 total yards again. You just can't. I'm just curious what's a good year for Saquon, coming off 2,283 total yards.
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, Patrick Johnson, by the way, another Giant joining the Eagles, originally an Eagle, but coming back to
Well,
Philly.
yeah, that's sort of like I don't think Patrick Johnson probably really was thrilled about being a Giant for a few weeks last year anyway, but
Yeah,
probably back where he wanted to be.
right. Um, Saquon, here's the thing with Saquon. History tells us that he just can't be anywhere near as productive as he was last year. And I would contend he had the best running back season in NFL history last year. Like I truly believe that when you factor the playoffs in, he literally had the most yards of any running back ever from game one to the final game, including playoffs. Just the way he was so important to this team, I really think he should have been MVP, even from a narrative standpoint of just like who was the most like defining player of last season. Like, what was the story out of the NFL last year? It was about like running backs resurging, specifically him and Derrick Henry and Saquon like being the guy. Like Josh Allen had an awesome season. Lamar Jackson had an awesome season. They were not like the defining characters of last season. So Saquon was awesome. Super Bowl wasn't even a great game for him, and yet he still had like over whatever 100 yards from scrimmage. Still, Chiefs are really focused, on bottling him up, and that really didn't work out so well for them otherwise because it opened things up for Jalen Hurts and the Eagles passing attack. But just even that, having the ability to still impact the game when you're not getting your numbers like he did, that was incredible. So amazing season for him last year. Feels like he can't be as good as this year, but I was in a position last year at this time where I was doubting the impact that Saquon could have. I didn't think he was going to stink for the Eagles. I just thought he would be kind of like solid, good, like a good
Mhm.
good addition, but not like this, sea change, needle moving kind of addition. And he absolutely was. So maybe it's an overcorrection, but like I just have put myself in a spot mentally where like I'm not going to doubt Saquon Barkley. I can't be that guy. I already was that guy.
Mhm.
Made me look really dumb. So
Mhm.
I actually think that when we talk about he's not going to be as good as he was last year. Yeah, no, like, duh, because he can't be. The bar is so high. But could he still
Mhm.
be like really good this year? Yeah, I think he could because I think that guy is different than a lot of those other running backs that had these
Yeah.
big seasons. I'm just not going to. Everyone can say he's not going to be as good, and I'm not going to argue with you. But I'm also not going to be the person like leading that charge. I'm not going to be the one doubting Saquon.
It's so interesting with Saquon, and I know there are still Giants fans who shake their head about how the Giants could have let him go. Um, but I still look at it like this, and just tell me if you agree. I have always thought that drafting a running back number 2 overall to begin a rebuild is not the right approach because I always look at it like you need pieces around a running back to take full advantage of a running back. So I've always looked at the Derrick Henrys and the Saquon Barkleys and the top running backs as finishing pieces, not starting pieces, not beginning pieces. And I always, as much as I hate to think about Saquon in Philly and all of that, I think that Saquon is the best running back in football, maybe the best running back since Barry Sanders when it comes to open field, when it
Mm.
comes to what happens once he gets to the second level.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's honestly, he's pedestrian at at the first level. He's like every other running back. If there's no place to go, he's going to dance and prance and do what he can, but if there's no place to go, there's no place to go. If you get him to the second level, he's as special as it gets. And the Eagles can get him there on a consistent basis, and I just feel like it proves my point that a running back like that is a finishing piece and not a starting piece.
Yeah, I think the mistake, and I guess this is obvious, I would think for Giants fans, it's like not trading him right sooner. in terms of like, what was it in 2023? They could have traded him. They were 2-6. I'm seeing here before the NFL trade deadline. At that point, like a pretty clear point where you're sellers, and you have some kind of idea that you don't want to or might not be able to resign this guy. I don't know what you get. Might not be amazing haul, but get something. And also, you can control where he goes at that
Mhm.
point too. And maybe it doesn't guarantee he necessarily stays with that team and resigns with that team, but there's a higher chance he doesn't go in division maybe if you trade him to a team and he might like it there. So I think that's the mistake to ultimately lament, is that what do you do holding on to players when it's clearly a lost season?
Yeah, I I know Joe Shane gets grief for that, but I also feel like maybe that's misplaced because I feel like that's more Giants ownership driven.
Yeah, they have to sign off on that, right?
Well, and John Mara in particular has said, "I hate trading players at the deadline because it feels like giving up on the season." And there's a sense of you're 2-6, you're
Hmm.
1-7, you're whatever, you're not going anywhere. This player has told you over and over that he's not signing at the number that you're comfortable with.
Hmm.
So what's the likelihood you're going to be able to keep him? So I can't argue with you much there. I wanted to ask you, you kind of mentioned it though. You kind of mentioned one or two of the competitions, but training camp starts next week. Uh, Storylines for Philly. What are you really looking for?
Yeah, there's a couple of battles, like I mentioned the safety cornerback with Keely Ringo and Dory Jackson there. You look at right guard, where that's really the only spot in the Eagles offense that's not like settled in terms of returning. Like everything else is basically locked in. 10 of 11 starters all locked in there. The one is Tyler Steen at guard. The Eagles lose Mekhi Becton in free agency. They're turning it over to Steen, who they took early third round a couple of years ago. They have him. They're going to see if that works out. If not, they could maybe kind of turn to Matt Pryor, who they had drafted in 2018 and kind of has bounced around the league as a journeyman, has kind of developed into, I think, a decent starter if you have to. Not ideal, but if you have to go that route. I think the biggest storyline with the Eagles is that there are no storylines and that like there's no drama. But
Hmm,
that's not to be taken for granted in a league where
right.
you know Terry McLaurin is coming out and complaining about his contract, like in the Commanders and their situation. TJ Watt, Trey Hendrickson, the Bengals as a whole, who knows what they're doing? They have no idea apparently how to run a team.
Hmm.
Quibbling over like a rookie contract or like
Hmm.
guarantees in a contract with their first round pick who might go
Yep.
back to college. Like
Yep.
the Eagles don't have any of that, knock on wood. But like
Hmm.
I think that's the biggest story, is that like knock on wood also they're relatively healthy. We want to see, okay, when does Nakobe Dean get back on the field? I tend to think he's gonna have to start the season on the pup list. It's gonna be a really interesting year for him because he's gonna be a free agent after this season. And then the Eagles drafted Jahad Campbell in the first round, and he didn't do a ton in spring practices. Is he healthy? We don't know yet. So, we'll get an update on those things and see where those guys are at health wise. It's pretty big, to see if they can actually play or not, or how soon they're able to play. But again, big picture, I think the storyline is that there's just no kind of drama going on, and that feels like a good spot to be. And also, it's very different than where the Eagles were coming off the Super Bowl last time. It's not a matter of just you win the Super Bowl, there's no drama. Last time the Eagles won the Super Bowl, their backup quarterback won the Super Bowl, and their starting quarterback was coming off an ACL injury in Carson Wentz. And there was a lot of talk about, should Carson Wentz even be the starter. So it's
Hmm.
definitely a lot more drama free and different this time.
I need to ask you, I always like getting, outside perspectives on the team that I cover, of course, the Giants. And the Giants at this point are, they're a far cry from where the Eagles are. But, but the Giants have had what I would consider to be a really good offseason. People ask me, and I kind of consider the Giants to be, everybody does, winners and losers of the offseason. And I look at the Giants as an offseason winner for the simple reason, look, first of all, whether he turns out to be, the franchise guy or not, they have at least put a quarterback in place who
Hmm.
who gives them hope
Hmm.
that he's their franchise guy of the future. And I've also said that I look across the roster and I can make an argument that the Giants are either clearly better or potentially better at every position across the roster. So I guess, what I want to ask you is, what is your sort of outside perspective on the offseason that the Giants had and where they are at this point?
They had to take a chance on a quarterback. Like, you just have to. At some point, you literally just have to do it, like, because there's a chance it works out. And I think that's been a big mistake for the Giants in years past. That's why I was happy they took Malik Neighbors last year. Everyone's like, "Oh, Neighbors is going to be a good player." Yeah, okay, great. I don't care. It doesn't matter if they don't have a quarterback. I didn't believe in Daniel Jones, and voila. Neighbors, I'm sure will is going to be a good player, but it won't matter unless Jackson Dart hits. I liked the Jameis Winston addition for the Giants. I thought that made sense. I'm like, okay, here's a guy, bridge starter, some competency, just a fun player for I'm sure Giants fans to be able to root for in terms of personality, in terms of not having a lot of fun things to root for in recent years. Russell Wilson signing on top of that was odd to me. I didn't love that. I do like Russell Wilson more than most people, and I still think he can play a little bit. That move to me kind of screams like, okay, this is worrying. This is Joe Shane, Brian Dable worrying about job security more than it is the organization making a move that serves their best long term interest. It's not like this disastrous move that hamstrings them forever, but I just don't think it works in terms of their long term as much as they're focused a little too much on the short term. A short term that is pretty daunting when you look at the Giants' schedule this year. I mean, all the NFC's teams have a tough schedule with how the formula works, but especially that start that they have here that I'm looking at, like it's just a tough road in the beginning, and I think it'll be Jackson Dart time sooner than later, and that'll be good for the Giants to actually get a look at what he looks like and see if he can be the guy or not. So I respect that part of it, but to me, I mean, I still think like Joe Shane and Brian Dable and the Giants as a whole are just not very threatening.
No, and I don't blame you for for feeling that way because they haven't been threatening for a while. But for me, it sort of feels like they're maybe in terms of rebuild, they're maybe where they should have been a couple years ago. Finally, putting a quarterback in place. Um, I feel like they've vastly upgraded their defensive personnel. Um, they're better at quarterback than they were a year ago, whether it's Russ or whether it's Jameis. They're better at quarterback than they were a year ago. And even if it gets to be Jackson Dart and he struggles, they're better off with him struggling and growing and developing,
Right.
than they were the last couple of years because that might lead to something better. The big question is how much it's going to matter because of that schedule and you're going from 3-14 and you know can you even get to 7 or 8 wins? And that's
Yeah,
tough.
I'm interested because I feel like you almost have to commit to Sheen and Dable another year just because of what the Giants' outlook looks like here, assuming Dart at least shows some kind of promise within here. Um, because like I think have you done this? Someone has mentioned like just about how the Giants have not been syncing up like quarterback and GM and coach. Like it's always a different kind of
Well,
pairing there.
what happened, and John Mara has mentioned this, before. I mean, they drafted Daniel Jones 6th overall, and obviously, this many years later, we know that that didn't work out the way that they wanted it to work out. But they also, when you look at the what people consider to be the proper way to develop quarterbacks, the Giants fired Pat Shermer after a year, and Pat Shermer got a pretty good, pretty promising rookie season out of Daniel Jones. They fired Daniel Jones. They fired Pat Shermer. They bring in Joe Judge, and that was a mistake. And they bring in Jason Garrett, and what the two of them succeeded in doing over 2 years was beating every last bit of creativity and risk taking out of Daniel Jones and turning him into, either a runner or a guy that basically threw a bunch of stick routes, and you know, Brian Daboll got a good year out of Daniel Jones in 2022, but you're talking about three different head coaches. You're talking about two different GMs. You're talking about a half a dozen different play callers in Daniel Jones's career, basically. And that's no way to give a quarterback a chance to. I don't know what Daniel Jones's ceiling is or ever would have been, but that's no way to get the best out of a young quarterback. And I've heard other people say the same thing about Daboll and Dart. It's Having said that, having lived through that, it's going to be very difficult for the Giants to fire Brian Daboll at the end of the year if the Daboll-Dart relationship looks like it might go somewhere, looks like it might take them someplace. So it's tough because you would think 9-25 at the last 2 years would put the guy firmly on the hot seat.
Mhm.
And I've been saying I'm not sure his seat's quite as hot as people think it is.
Yeah, I think they either had to move on from him like this offseason or commit to him for a couple more years, basically,
You
is
you
how I
you
feel.
you almost because Shane and Dable drafted Jackson Dart, unless it's a complete disaster and Dart looks like a mistake,
Mhm.
you almost have to let these guys see if they can make it work, and that's gonna take more than 1 year.
Yeah, which I don't love. Like, like for the Giants' perspective, I don't love that. Like, I would have made the flip. I thought it was a good time to wipe the slate clean here and start over a little bit. But we'll see.
Yep. Hey, last question for you. Eagles go back to back or not?
I mean, the thing I always bring up when I'm asked this question is like there hasn't been a repeat winner in the NFC East since 2004. So to just
Mhm.
merely assume the Eagles will win the Super Bowl again, which winning one is just hard enough. Um, like I have a hard time thinking that'll be the case because it's just there's so many things that aren't in the Eagles' control. Like the Eagles could have pressed every single button right that like they needed to press this offseason, and it might not matter because someone gets hurt or the schedule's tougher or whatever, or another team is just so good that they're really good too, but the other team is just that much better. So
And it might be
I feel
just
like
better on one day, you know?
better on one day, exactly.
Mhm.
Regret the factors, this regression. I do think the Eagles. Here's what I'll say: I do think the Eagles have a really good shot to repeat as division winners and break that streak. I don't really love the rest of the division. I don't think the rest of the division is like. I don't see it. I almost want to not pick the Eagles to win the division because of that streak, and I feel foolish for going against that. But there isn't another team out there that I look at and I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to be the team because I think the Commanders are going
Well,
to take a step back.
actually, let's talk about that a little bit. So I guess I lied about last question for you. Um, I almost I almost agree with you, or I kinda do agree with you that there's potential for regression with the Commanders. It's a Houston Texans kind of scenario
100%.
with with CJ Stroud, being such a dominant force as a rookie. And the fact that they regressed a little bit last year doesn't mean he's not a great quarterback, not going to be a great
Right.
quarterback. But Mark Schofield of SB Nation always says quarterback development and development in general is not linear. It
Mhm.
doesn't always go straight up.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
always struggles along the way. So, and Washington relied last year on a lot of aging veterans on 1 year guys to fill gaps and guys that had good years. And can they make up for that? And can Jaden Daniels, be what he was last year again? So I tend to agree. Washington might win the division. They might finish third.
I am really looking forward to the Commanders fans season because I think there's a lot of humble pie that those people are going to be eating and that team is going to be eating. Because look, again, the mitigating factor here and what can make me look foolish is Jaden Daniels. And I will say
Mhm.
once again, I'm not doubting him. I think he's going to be a really good player, and I don't even necessarily doubt the Commanders' arc as a whole. Like I think the 2026 Commanders I might be afraid of that team once again. We'll see. Or at least I could have been if they had invested in like a real core of like young players to surround Dean Daniels with, which they don't have a lot of draft picks now because they're trading them for aging players who, by the way, aren't necessarily like thrilled about their contract situations. There's so many reasons to believe the Commanders are going to take a step back this year in terms of when you look at teams that have made a leap from being as bad as the Commanders were in 2023 to 2024. Then you look at what those teams do, like that season after they make this huge improvement in wins, they all take a significant step back. Like it almost always happens.
Hmm.
Not to mention, the Commanders won a lot of these like one score games last year. Obviously, the Hail Mary, one of those. Like
Well,
you're just not going to get that same kind of luck again.
yeah.
And the fact that you're relying on all these they have the oldest roster in the NFL. It's just I think it's so like foolish for them to be like, oh, we were one game away from the Super Bowl. We can. It's simple as we just pick up right where we left off last year. We add these pieces, these name players, and we're good. We're gonna win. We're
Hmm.
gonna be great. We're gonna be awesome. I think that's a mistake. I think they should have perceived that. Hey, we might take a bit of a step back this year. So I'm not saying don't try to improve the roster because I get like Jaden Daniels is in a rookie contract. You want to take advantage of that window, but I think you can do that while adding core players who are going to be like around for multiple seasons and give you multiple chances, as opposed to saying let's push all of our chips in right now in a year where again you're a lot of things point to stepping back. So I just think it's been a really foolish offseason from them, and I think that they're not like getting ripped enough for that. Like nationally, I think national people are like, "Oh, they were really good last year. Now they added these pieces; they're going to be even better this year." Like I think that's a very wrong way of thinking about it.
Yeah, adding Debo Samuel does nothing to concern me. I think Debo Samuel is past it in terms of his best days. But let me ask you about the Dallas Cowboys. And I always think that the way that I always look at the Dallas Cowboys is they're never as good as the sum of their parts, never as good as their fan base thinks they are. And the biggest problem is that they just get in their own way with some of the decisions that they make and some of the ways that they do things.
Well, not paying Micah Parsons in part. Like this should have been done a year ago, and here he
Mhm.
still is. I guess they will pay him at some point, but like it's going to cost them a lot more than it needed to at any
Mhm.
point.
Yeah.
So, that's something they're obviously all excited about the George Pickens edition. I think George Pickens can be either very like tantalizing, like he can make some catches that like will blow your mind. He can also do some really dumb things that will also kind of blow your mind about how dumb they are. And the fact that the Steelers, who are pretty good about knowing when to acquire and when to offload wide receivers, are giving him up, kind of makes you, I think, should give you some pause if you're a Cowboys fan about that. I think the Cowboys are kind of in a good position from a standpoint of, there's so much Commanders hype, so much Eagles hype. They're kind of like forgotten about a little bit, and maybe they're laying in the weeds a little bit. However, Brian Schottenheimer, I think, is like, what if he's a disaster? He might be a terrible head coach. He's not been a good coordinator for most of his career. So I don't know about that. Dak Prescott, I think people forget about this too, or at least don't talk about this enough. He didn't just get hurt last year. He was bad and then he got hurt. Like that part doesn't, the first part somehow doesn't get talked about as much. It's just like, oh, well, he got hurt. So the Cowboys couldn't have possibly been good. They weren't good before he got hurt. So, and he's what? He's going to be in this like age 32 or so season now. He's had multiple injuries throughout his career. Even if he does play well, again, this is a guy who was one of the weakest playoff resumes of any quarterback. Who's like won a play at least like one playoff game before. So okay, the Cowboys are great. Is anyone believing in Dak going on a run in the playoffs, or is he going to do more of the same and choke again? So I think they might be slept on a little bit. However, I say that, and I look at their win total, the projected over under win total. Do you know what it is, Ed?
No.
7.5. Isn't that a low number? Like I've seen it to the point where RJ and Cowboys fans are like, "Oh, take the over. It's so easy." Like, I feel like that is kind of a little suspiciously low there, so that kinda makes me think about that too.
Yeah, it's just I always feel like the Cowboys are just never what they should be and never what the attention that they get would make you think that they are. And I think that's just, you know, a hangover from what they were 30 years ago that still hasn't gone away. Anyway, I think that That's a good place for us to end. So, Giants fans, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. And also, please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.